everyone, it's Daphne from Scrap and Create. Today we're going to make another mini album and we're going to do something a little bit different. If you have followed our channel for any time or seen some of our videos, you know most of our mini albums are done with 4 pocket pages. Today I'm going to show you how to make a mini album. It's going to be 7 by 9. The outside dimensions will be 7.5 by 9.5. The internal pocket page will be 7 by 9. And it will have 5 pocket pages. So I'm going to show you how to add that additional page to your album. And then I'm going to go over in detail kind of how to calculate that on your own. So over time, if you want to make an album similar to something we've done, but you want more pages, you'll understand the techniques behind how to manage and measure for your paper. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're going to need a few things. You're going to need some score tape. You really can't get away without score tape. We won't be really using any glue today. You'll need the tape. Something to trim with, a pick tool. I use this to pick up the back of the tape. Some people are more effective using their fingernails. For me, that's a real challenge. I don't know why. You'll need a bone folder. And then I use this tool to actually do my scoring. I think it makes a crisper score line. But your bone folder also serves that purpose. This is just a straight edge I use to tear my tape with. You'll need a good, at least if you do it the way I do it, a good metal ruler, at least 12 inches long, longer if you have it. Something to write with. I've got a pencil and a black marker, and your cardstock, of course. And then the last thing you're going to need is some chipboard. Okay, with that, we are going to go ahead and get started. And we're going to get started talking about, as I mentioned before, the Hinge and how to determine the paper measurement to add additional pages to your mini album. So as you can see, I mocked one up and it has 5 hinges on it. So this would hold for 5 pages. So I've already got detailed instructions on how to do this for 4, so I'm not going to go over that. What I am going to do is show you what I put together for this album, give you the measurements for this album, and then kind of talk to you as I go along about how I came up with it. So this album, as I mentioned, is going to be 7.5 by 9.5. I did not have any 12 by 12 paper, which I would recommend you get matching 12 by 12 paper if you can. The paper I chose to use is the Recollections from Michaels, and they don't carry the cream in the 12 by 12 anymore. They have white and black, but not the cream. So you can make it work, but I would recommend using a broader piece of paper if you can. And here's why. Once you get all your pleats in, or hinges, you have a little flange that's left over. This flange helps us attach this hinge to the inside of our book. All of the hinges will be inside the spine area, and this will actually flow over into the cover of the front and back. So it's better to have a little bit more because these serve kind of as an anchor attached to the outside pages, in addition to all the stuff that's being held together inside the spine area. So now that I've said that, you can work around it, but like I said, if you have a 12 by 12, I'd recommend using that. So the next thing you want to do is you want to trim the height of your paper to be sure that it'll fit inside your pocket. And the way I do that is I determine the size of my pocket page, and in this case, it's 7 by 9. 7 by 9. So that means the height of this needs to be slightly smaller than 9 because I've got a pocket page that's going to go over this. And this piece right here needs to slip inside the pocket page. And here's a pocket page already made. It'll need to slip in like so. So it can't be exactly the same size. It needs to be smaller. How much smaller? That really depends on you. I don't want it to be much smaller than the pocket page, so I make it 1/8 inch smaller. So the height of this is 8 7/8, intended to go be married up and paired with an 7 by 9 pocket page. So I just make it 1/8 inch shorter. So it makes for a very snug fit. So it's a little bit of a challenge getting the pocket pages on, but they don't wobble at all when you get them on. And then you don't have to worry about sliding your pocket up or down. Some people make it a 1/4 inch shorter. Then you have to decide, if my page is a 1/4 inch taller, do I have the excess on top or on the bottom? Mine is so close, there's very little room, so it pretty much fits on and it doesn't really slide up or down. So that's why I do it this way, but you can change your the model if you want. You can make this considerably smaller if you want to. Okay, with that, I'm going to sit down because I need to focus a little bit more on some of what goes into designing this. So in the case of this hinge, because I knew I wanted five pages attached to it, it's pretty easy to find your midpoint because you're going to have one of the hinges be in the center. Now I'm going to pull in my scoreboard and show you how I did it. So here's my scoreboard. So again, if you have a 12 by 12, that's what I would recommend. I did not have a 12 by 12, so I'm working with an 8.5 by 11. And I know I need nearly 9 inches of height, so I can't do it this way. Otherwise, I'm going to stop at 8.5, and that's quite a bit shorter than the length of the pocket page. Now I could make it this height and then manage the placement of my pocket up or down, but I prefer not to do that. So I rotated it this way. And then I know that the midpoint for 8.5 is 4 1/4 right here. And I know, because I have 5 hinges, I need to go to the midpoint of the paper. So I need 15 score lines to make 5 peaks. So if I do my first score line in my midpoint at 4 1/4, then I need to make a score line every 1/2 inch away from here. I need to do that 7 times. And then I need to back up from here and every 1/2 inch make a score line, and I need to do that 7 times. So I'll have 7 score lines on this side, 7 on this side. This would make the 15th score line. So that's how I came up with these measurements. So I took this piece of paper, trimmed it down to 8 7/8, and then I did just what I described. This is an 8.5 by 7 or by 8 7/8. And I did just what I described in terms of placing those score lines. Some people don't like a 1/2 inch gusset. I like it this way for a couple of reasons. One, it's very easy. It's uniform. It's a 1/2 inch a score line every 1/2 inch. The other thing is I like to add a lot of flaps and pockets. And when you do that, and then you add photos on top of it, it really starts building up. And I don't want my pages so wide that the cover doesn't close completely. I want my cover to close completely around my album. I don't want it to spring out because I didn't leave enough room in my gussets. So most of the time, this is the right measurement for me. People that want to keep it simple and maybe only a pocket, no flaps, they don't intend to do a lot of layering techniques like waterfalls inside the pages, a 1/4 inch gusset would work. And it's the same process. The measurements are slightly different. You would do a 1/2 inch, a 1/2 inch, a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch. But again, like I said, this one's so bulletproof. It's the one I go to all the time. I do recommend that the peak be at least a 1/2 inch because I think you need that much grabbing onto the pocket page to make sure that it's secure. So that's how I came up with these measurements. Once you do that and you score it and you get through your folding, you're going to put tape on one side of each one of these peaks. So I've got tape on this side, and so on. I'm going to remove that tape and I'm going to pinch my pleats or my hinges together, and you'll start to see this emerge. When you're finished, it'll look much like this. Your flanges might be longer, and hopefully they are, because you want as much flange as possible so that it'll go up and around the outside covers. So when you're finished pinching everything together, it's going to look like this. So let's go ahead and do that together. And then I'm going to stop there, and then I'm going to go over kind of how I got to this, how I measure my spine once I get this complete. So now you know you want 5 pages. The next step is going to be, after you finish your spine, is to figure out what your cover is going to look like and your spine, so that you can trim out your chipboard pieces. So we'll go over that next. And I'm going to show you how to do it 2 different ways. One for the mathematically inclined and one for the visual. Okay, so there we have it. So that was pretty simple, pretty straightforward. We've got our 5 hinges now. It's pretty straightforward. So again, regardless of the number of hinges, you want to lay your paper down, trim it to the height of your pocket, lay your paper down, find your midpoint, and then determine how many score lines you need to get the number of hinges you need, and then score away from the center. Okay, so how do I figure out how much paper I want? Well, the way I do it, and this is a quick visual, I always do a quick sketch. I'll move my scoreboard so I can write, of how many pages I want. So let's say I want 5. So I know I need a leading 1/2 inch gusset, and I need a 1/2 inch on 2 sides to make what is the hinge. So this is the hinge and this is the gusset. I know I need a gusset following the hinge. So for every single page, you'll need a gusset in the front, in the back, and a hinge in the middle. So there's page 1. Then I'm going to want page 2, 3, 4, let's do 5, let's do 6. Okay? So for each one of these gussets, it's 0.5. It's a 1/2 inch, right? So we'll take our gusset, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We have 7 gussets times 0.5. That's how we're going to come up with kind of what this spread is. Because remember, when we're finished, these 2 things are going to be pinched together, so they almost disappear. So if you have 7 gussets at a 1/2 inch each, you're going to have 3.5 inches. That's almost perfect, but not quite. Each one of these, when folded together, actually takes up a little bit of space, and the amount of space that it takes up, and it's very insignificant, but if you want to be precise, the amount of space that it takes up on 65-pound paper would be 0.025. And you would need to multiply that by the number of pages, and in this case, it's 6. And then you get another number here. And I have to do that longhand because I don't know what the answer is. So we have 0.25 by 6, 15, 1, 2. That doesn't seem right. 0.25, 6, 12, 13, 14, 15. Oh, 0.025, that's why. I was leaving out a 0. So what I finish with is 0.150. And if you divide that, you get a, let's see, what is that going to be? It's going to be 125. That's 1/8 of an inch. 125. An 1/8 of an inch. Two 5.25. I think that's a 32nd. I can't, I have to figure out what that is, but it is something, some percentage of an inch. So in this case, you would need to make this your overall spine would equal 3.5 plus 0.150. So in this case, it would be 3.650. Okay, so just under 3 3/4. The other way to come up with this measurement, and sorry that took so long, but the other way to come up with the measurement is go ahead and build your spine like I did. And then you know you need a 1/2 inch from here to here to be your gusset. So you can come up with that 1/2 inch a couple of different ways. You can write your little tick mark, or you can do a score line. And I'm actually going to do a tick mark. And here's where my ruler comes in handy. So if you do your 1/2 inch from the hinge line, I'm going to move the background cream so you can see it better. A 1/2 inch from this score line. And this is actually 3/4 inch, so I'm going to put a tick mark at a 1/2 inch. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. There's my 1/2 inch. Now if I measure between this 1/2 inch and this 1/2 inch, if I can get my ruler to behave, making sure that everything is flat, because that's how it's going to go into the book. You want to make sure that your hinge is pushed all the way down to the paper, because it wants to curl because of all the scoring that we've done. So now if you measure from this tick line to this tick line, you come up with 3 1/8. 3 1/8. And those are the measurements that I had actually done here last night. So with 5 pages, we have 6 times the 1/2 inch gusset. You're always going to have one more gusset than you're going to have page, because you have a leading and a trailing gusset. So you have 6 times 1/2 inch, that's 3. Plus I know when I create my peaks, I'm going to use up a little bit of paper for each peak, and that's 0.025 times 5 peaks. That came out to 0.125, or 1/8. So that's also the equivalent of 1/8. So that's how I came up with 3,125 mathematically. But if you do what I just did, you can come up with that visually as well. It's only, you have to build the hinge first if you want to back into it that way. Build the hinge first, add your tick marks, measure between the two. That's the width of your spine. You add another page, same thing. Make sure you have a leading and a trailing gusset. Put your tick marks or a score line, measure between the two. That is the width of your spine. So there's not a whole lot of magic there. Pretty straightforward. I'm going to cover one more thing here. When you are doing your hinge, again, you always want to start with the middle of the paper. So I did mine this way, and it was 4 1/4. My preference is always to have more on either side, but always start in the middle. If I was going to change the orientation to 8.5 by 11, my midpoint would be 5.5. I would use that as my center line and score away from it. In the case of an even number of pages, you will not have a peak right at the center of your page. It'll actually be offset slightly. So make a note that 5.5 is the center, but what I really want is for this gusset to be the center of the spread. So I'm going to back off to 5 1/4 and 5 3/4. There's my midpoint of the paper, and there's my middle gusset. So you just back off your midpoint a 1/4 inch if it's even pages, and you score directly on the midpoint if you have odd pages. So it's that straightforward. So hopefully with that, everybody will be able to modify and customize their hinges as desired. So we are done with that lesson for now. I'm going to chop this video up and move this over into a tips section. So if you didn't want to go through the whole tutorial, you can just get a refresher on how to make your make your hinge and the number of pages you want fit the book that you are designing. Okay, so now I'm back to the one I've designed for this project. I'm double checking to make sure that it is the height that I want, 8 7/8, and it is. I'm going to move my notes apart away. Offline, I went ahead and created 4 of the 5 pocket pages that we'll be doing, because I don't think I need to walk you through 5 times the same thing, but I am going to show you how to put one pocket page together here, just in case you hadn't seen any of my previous videos. So because I want my pocket to be 7 by 9, this measures 9.5, and it'll measure by 7. Okay, right now it's 9.5 by 8.5, and here's why. I do a couple of things to make sure that I have very tight right angles and that my pockets are exactly the same size. If you haven't done a lot of mini albums, you may not know yet, but every single sheet in your 50 pack isn't going to be exactly 8.5 by 11 or 12 by 12. Some are going to be a little smaller, some are going to be bigger. So you can't trust scoring a 1/2 inch and believing that if I score it a 1/2 inch, I only have 9 left over. There's no way to be perfectly sure about that. So what I do is I score my 1/2 inch, fold it, and then I put it in my trimmer and I line it up off the score line and come across and make sure it's at 9, and then I trim it. That way I know I actually have a 9-inch pocket. It's not smaller. It can't be smaller because I've already used up the little bit of paper that's required for this score line to be turned under. So I do it for the front and for the back. Now these should be exactly the same length. I'm not relying on what came out of the ream. I know that it's 9 inches from the score line. So the next thing we need to do is make sure that it's 7 inches across. So putting these two things together can sometimes be tedious and a little challenging to get them perfectly square. So one of the things I like to do is wait to trim the outside edge, or the edge that goes towards the spine. This would be the spine. This is the edge of the book. Wait to trim these two down until I get these attached. And the reason I do that is if for some reason I am slightly off on my installation, I can trim it off. It gives me an opportunity to trim off an awkward edge or an edge that doesn't meet perfectly. If you trim them after they're taped together, that won't change. That will be a perfectly trimmed edge. And so I like to do it that way. Not everybody does. Some people like to trim everything down at once and then go and glue everything together. But it doesn't take that long to put these pockets together in the first place. And I have found that having these be precise saves me a lot of time when I'm designing my flaps, because there's no variation between the pages. So I know if I have a full-length flap, it's going to be the same for page 1 as it is for page 8. So that's the thought process behind it. And I do think it takes a little more time to put it together this way, but I buy that time back when I'm adding my flaps and customizations to the page. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and put this one together. So what we're doing is we're taking the 2 flanges, or hinge, depending on how you want to refer to that, and they're going to be on opposing sides. So I take one part of the tape off, and I want to get this corner as perfect as I can. And because I've only got one part of it taped down, it allows me to kind of swing the paper around until it's fully aligned. And I have this little tab here, and it will function like a zipper as I pull down, and I'm going to pull and press as I go, holding the paper in place. And I'm just unzipping that tape and pressing down as I go. And that's it. So that's the technique for getting your pocket page together. And that's what you're looking for. I mean, that is pretty tight, and it's actually even hard to see that the 2 pieces of paper are coming together here. So once you're done with that, before you go to the other side, you want to burnish this in place. because you want this to be as flat and smooth across this plane as possible so that you don't wind up with a page that bows. So now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take off an edge. I'm going to pull this across. I'm going to fold my flange down, press my hand to make sure that I don't have any bowing in my pocket. And that's it. Now you'll repeat this process for whatever number of pages you want. In this case, we're going to do 5, and I've pre-done 4, and this is the 5th one. So the last thing I need to do now is I need to trim this page down. This is 9. I need to trim this. Did I say no? This is 9. I need to trim this down by 7. And when I say this down, so the pocket opens this way. And it's going to get it inserted to the book this way. So this needs to be 7. So I'm going to put this in my trimmer and trim down to 7. And you just can't get a cleaner edge than that because I didn't trim until I married the 2 pieces of paper together. Now, if you want to go that one extra step, in this case, I had enough paper that I could have trimmed a 1/4 inch off this side and the rest off the other side so that I know I have 2 crisp trimmed edges because I trimmed something off each side. I didn't do that in this case, but you can, especially if you find that your edges are not perfectly lined up. Take a 1/4 inch off one side, take the rest off the other. So those are my tips for that. So this is done. I've got 5 pages. I've got a hinge. So the next thing we need is some chipboard. And I have buried in my supplies here, I have some chipboard. So I pre-trimmed my chipboard, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my method for that. So I have tried lots of things to trim chipboard, and my hands are old and they are unhappy with the level of pressure that I have to apply to trimming chipboard. So this is my least favorite part of the whole process. And I have found that because the chipboard is so thick, when you're running it through a trimmer, it really wants to torque. So you have to put a lot of pressure and effort on holding your chipboard straight in your trimmer, or it wants to torque one way or another. So I've just not been very successful at getting it to stay still. So what I've done is I've actually gone back to old school. So I trim my chipboard by marking it with a pencil and then using my metal and a box cutter to trim these. Now I have an X-Acto knife, and X-Acto knives are great, but they are not meant for cutting chipboard. If you want to cut your chipboard, go to the dollar store, get the cheap box cutter, and then whenever you feel like you're having to pull too hard on the blade, replace the blade. The cheap ones, I think you can get them for $1, and they have the blade that snaps off. So you've essentially got, 10 blades built in. That's what I use, and I have found that to be the best. I get the best result for the least effort, and it's relatively low cost. The other reason I stay away from trimming these with my trimmer is it pretty much ruins your trimmer for paper. So I really don't recommend it. So like I said, go old school. The only issue I have with this ruler is it's slightly over 12 inches. So if I'm trimming down a chipboard that's 12 inches, it winds up just barely going edge to edge. If this was 14 inches, it would be ideal. The other thing I do to try to minimize the amount of trimming I have to do for chipboard is I often buy packs of 8.5 by 11 chipboard. 8.5 by 8.5 is my go-to mini album size. If I'm using 8.5 by 11 chipboard, I only have to trim 1 sliver off 2 pages, and the sliver I trim off, guess what, works for the hinge. So it is, it's economical, and it's also easier for me to trim because it's not as large a format as the 12 by 12. But if you're doing something larger than 8.5, you really gotta bump up to the 12 by 12. So I have both, but the 8.5 by 11 is kind of my go-to pack. So there is all the information you need or ever wanted to know about chipboard. Now, in this next phase, we're going to cover this chipboard with cardstock to match the hinges that we've already done. And you're going to need a method for spacing the spine from the cover. So this is what I do. Everybody does it a little bit different. Some people eyeball it, some people measure it. I take whatever chipboard I'm using, and they vary. So once you open a pack, save 2 strips of scraps, glue it together, and this is double wide. Stand it up while you're gluing it so it glues level, and then mark your downside. This is my downside, it's perfectly flat. This side is a little bit staggered. It might not come through for the video, but it doesn't go flush. I don't want that. I want this to be the downside. And it's 2 pieces wide. So I will use this when I'm putting this book together to create the space between the spine and the cover or back cover. And I have found that 2 widths of equal chipboard winds up being just perfect. So you'll use that, and you'll save your scrap for as long as you have that ream of chipboard. When you get your next set of chipboard, just save 2 more straps and do the whole process again. The width of the chipboard can vary ever so slightly, and there's really no investment in making this jig. It's 2 pieces of scrap. I do recommend that it's close to the length of the pages that you're trying to separate, because if it's considerably shorter, it's still easy to do that. Pinch it at the top and make it wide on the bottom. So my recommendation is to have it be close to the height of the 2 pieces that you're trying to space apart. Okay, enough of that. So I'm going to have to do something a little bit strange here that if I had 12 by 12 I wouldn't do. But I'm also going to show you how to get around having 12 by 12 when you're covering such a large album. So if I could do my pages this way, I really only need 2 because it's going to be wide enough to cover my book. But 8.5 is not tall enough to cover a 9.5-inch album. So I am going to have to change the orientation. And when I do that, I find out pretty quickly that two sheets are not going to be enough to cover this. Because remember, we have to have enough to wrap over the edge to get the finished look. So that means I'm going to have a piece in between. So let me turn that back over. So we know this is 3/8 of an inch wide. That's what this chipboard is. So I need to cover that space, have a 1/2 inch to adhere tape to on either side. And then the other thing is I don't want my seam in the spine. So I want my mid piece, if I'm going to have to add a mid piece, ideally I would have these 2 pieces, if it was a 12 by 12 married together, I would have a single seam. It would run down the middle of my spine. If I can't have that, I'm going to trim out a piece that will wrap around the spine and then come up over the front and back of the book. So I know it needs to be a minimum of 3.5 plus a 1/2 inch on either side. 3 1/8. So that makes it 4 1/8 just to get it attached. But because I want it to come over the edges, I'm going to add a little bit more. So if this is my spine and this is my cover, I want to start to think about how far do I want this page to come up and around to the cover. And I know I want a minimum of 1 inch, but probably more. So I think I should trim this out to be about 6 inches, and then I'm going to take a look at it, and then we'll decide if that will work. Okay. So now we have that at 6 inches across, 11 inches up and down. And again, this is only necessary if you don't have 12 by 12. Or if you have a book that's so big that you have to add a section in the middle. So if I overlap by about 1/2 on each side, roughly, and then I lay my spine down in the middle, you can see that it's going to come clear out of the spine area, which will be close to the edge of the I said spine, but you know, where the book attaches to the spine. I don't want it to be in that area. So this will come clear around. So I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm actually going to attach these 3 pieces together, and this will become the base sheet that covers all the cardstock. Okay. All right. Okay, I'm going to burnish this. I'm just going to do one side at a time. And I am lining the edge of my paper up with my grid on the bottom, just so that as I'm attaching these pages, they're going straight across. There we go. Okay, we're going to do that one more time. Now, if these are not perfect, don't stress about it, because, and I actually have a little bit of tape exposed here, but that's okay because I know I'm going to have my chipboard inside. So this is the inside, this will be the outside. This is all going to get wrapped over your chipboard. So if it's not perfectly straight, that's okay, because it is going to get wrapped. So what you're really going to wind up seeing is just the edges of your book once you have your wrap done. Okay, so the way I plan the rest from this point out is I place my spine first. The chipboard for the spine will be placed first, and then everything is going to be measured off of it. I'll measure the space between here and there and place this, and same thing over here. So right now I want to focus on just getting this centered so that these 2 lines are essentially in the same place on the outside of the book as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and measure this, and partly I normally eyeball this kind of stuff, but I've really got a lot of shadows I'm dealing with today, so I am going to go ahead and measure it and come up with what I think is the midpoint. And you want to mark it kind of low because your chipboard is going to be laying across the center. So 3.5 would be 5. So this looks like, wait a second, 2.5 would be 5. Yeah. So it looks like 2 and, in this case anyway, 2 5/8 is my midpoint. Two and 5/8, and then this is going to be 1.5 plus 1/16. Okay, so now I've got tick marks for my midpoint on the chipboard and on the paper. So I'm looking to line those up. And again, a lot of times this is stuff I'll just eyeball, but I've got some wicked shadows in here today. Okay, so there's my tick mark, I'm just lining those two things up, and that looks about right. So now we are ready to start laying in these pieces. And I realized I did not bring my fat tape in, so I'm gonna go get that. It's not required, but I am using a little bit wider tape to cover the chipboard pieces. And I reserve my 3/8 inch pretty much for the hinge process. So I'll be right back. Okay, everyone, I'm back. I've got my tape now. I'm gonna get the back of this covered. And then one of the things I wanna stress here is, shoot, my dog needs some attention, so I might have to take a break. I went and poked the bear. She was being so well behaved, and then I went in there and she was like, what? People are here? Don't skimp on your tape here. It's important that your spine is really well attached to the book. All the weight of your pages will rest on the spine. So make sure that you do a good job getting this fully covered with score tape. And this one's yeah, I think I'm going to be able to just perfectly get 5 strips on here. That's nice. And this tape I think that I'm using is, I have to think about it. They don't write it on the actual roll, but I think it's 5/8, a little over 1/2 inch. It just saves time. The thinner the tape is, the longer it takes you to, lay multiple strips down when you're doing large surface like this. And that really only happens, when you're building the book itself. When you're on to the decorating part, you really don't use large tape, wide tape. Okay, so I'm going to get this off, and we're going to get this centered and laid down. And then our spine will be in. We'll get our covers done. Get this wrapped. All right. Okay, clear my surface because I don't like a lot of clutter. I don't know if it's just me, but it seems like the wider tape is a lot stickier. It just could be me. I don't know. All right, so the other thing I need to do is I probably want to do a reference line. So this is 9.5 and this is 11. So I'm trying to think of how far. 10.5. So I think I want never mind. Just do what I do, don't listen to me. Okay, it's in. Okay, now we want to get our 2 covers, or just one at the moment, I guess, doesn't really matter. And our spacer tool. So here's the spacer tool. There's my down arrows. So I know I need to go this way, like so. So I'm just kind of eyeballing it. And I am going to place this up and down based on where this is. So even if it's slightly askew, it doesn't matter. Everything's going to get wrapped. But we do want these two to line up. And they do. And they do. So if you've got a large variation between the height of your spine and your covers, you need to adjust that. It needs to be relatively close. Not perfect, but relatively close, because once you wrap it, that will mask some of the errors. But if it's more than, I would say, 1/8 of an inch off, you need to take it back and trim it. But mine are looking pretty good. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get score tape on this, and I'm going to frame it, and then I'm going to come across the center with some pieces. This needs a significant amount of score tape, but not like the spine. It won't be carrying any weight to speak of. It's really all on the spine where all the weight's going to be. Okay, so I've got my frame in, and so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put large pieces of tape across the center. And I'm not going to do solid tape. I think that is excessive and quite expensive, really. So this is how I cover the larger pieces of chipboard. I mean, you can add more tape if you want, but I don't think it's required. And we're going to do the same thing with the other piece. That didn't want to tear for me. All right, now I'm going to burnish everything and we're going to get these laid down. Okay. Now let's make sure we've got our spacer handy. Okay, got everything down. Now, if you're nervous about placing this, I mean, you can put glue over your tape so that you have a little bit of wiggle room before you lay it down. I'm pretty confident with my process these days, so I don't really do that. Another thing to do to help improve your confidence is when you're going to put this in, approach the installation at an angle so that really only a very small part of your chipboard is touching the paper until you've got it up and down the way you want it. Press it into your spacer and then lay it down. So that's the approach that I take. Now, having said all that, I'm stuck to it. Make sure your fingers are completely free of the adhesive as you're doing that, because a lot of times you'll get it just where you want it and you go to lay it down and you pull your fingers off and it shifts the board. So try to find a place where you can hang on to it. And here I'm between two pieces of tape where you're not sticking to the board itself, so that when you do pull your hand out, it doesn't take the board with it. I'm going to stand up so that I'm completely over my project. Now, as you're pushing the spacer against the spine, it should stand on its own. And you're looking for the height that it's consistent with the bottom, top, and you see even spacing. Okay, that's it. Now we're going to do the same thing on the other side. I can't remember if I burnished it. I'm going to do that again, just in case. It just makes the backing come off easier. Okay, now I'm looking for the spot. I'm going to hold on to it where my fingers will let go when I want to let go. I'm placing my jig so that the flat side is down against the paper, pushing my back cover into it. I'm going to nudge it up a little. And I'm pushing firmly toward the spine. It's not going anywhere. We have a lot of tape on it. I'm actually going to use my ruler. I've got such bad shadows today. I can't tell where it's going to lay down. Okay, I'm pushing hard, pulling my hand out, burnishing. Okay, we are done with that piece. Okay, so the next piece is all of this is going to get wrapped around the edges. So I'm going to lay down some tape, framing the hole. And here I'm using the 5/8 again. Not required. You can use the 3/8 here. So I frame the chipboard and then I come back and I run tape on the edge of the paper that's going to be wrapped. Okay. So I'm looking at this and it looks like there's a little excess here. So I'm going to trim some of this off. And normally I do that with a straight edge, but I didn't bring one in. So I'm going to trim it off by hand. And I'm just using the width of the ruler as my guide, which is about 1 1/8 inch wide. It's a little bit wider than 1 inch. And I'm just doing that to reduce some of the bulk that'll be on the inside of the book. Doesn't have to be perfect. It's all going to get covered up, but try to make a straight line. All right, that is done. I'm going to burnish everything. And then we're going to add a second layer of tape. And this tape is going to go on the outside edge of the paper. So as close to the outside edge as possible. Excuse me. I burnish everything. Okay, and we're going to start training the paper to move up. So I always, excuse me, I always adhere, and losing my voice, the length first and then come across. As you start to fold this into place, it actually tugs a little bit on this paper. So I do that last to allow for that slight bit of movement. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to trim off a little bit of these edges. I'm I'm gonna miter the corners, and I don't want all that bulk. But I have to figure out what I did with my scissors. I set them down, and I don't see them anymore. Oh my gosh, I threw them in the trash. How funny is that? Excuse me. Okay, so we're gonna miter these edges really quick. And I'm just gonna do a quick angle here. And actually, you should use your, go back to your jig. You want to make sure, I made the first mark too short, that you leave enough paper to come up and over the chipboard. And I don't know what just happened to my voice, but sorry about that. It doesn't seem to be coming back either. So cut on the outside of your line. You can always trim more. You can't add it later. Good grief. Sorry. Sorry, guys. Okay. Now we're ready to actually start folding it over. Okay, now we've already sort of folded it once and trained it into place. We want to start at the center and then smooth out. Wow, I don't know where all that came from. Anyway, I'm going to start at the center and smooth out. All right, now I've got that in. I'm going to start working the book so that we can open and close it. And okay, that looks good. Now we're ready to fold these ends over. So we're going to pull these up and over. Start that process. Now we'll get our tape off. All right, now here comes the tricky part. So now here's where we need to fold in our corners. I'm going to stand up and show you. Oops. So here you can see that we've got a little excess. You want to tuck that down so that when you come over, it will completely cover the corner. So you're flattening this edge down like so, so that when you come over, you've got an, oh, I'm outside of frame. Flatten this, sorry about that. I'll go over that one more time. Flatten this little piece down so that it goes up against your chipboard. And then when you come around to wrap it, it'll be nice and covered. So I've done that on all 4 of my corners, just pressing it straight down to cover the height of the chipboard. Okay, so you're going to do that on all 4 corners. And then you will pull your sides up and your corners should be beautifully covered. And then burnish everything into place. Flatten your corners out a little bit. There we go. That's done. Now we'll do this side. Okay, that's all done. So there is the cover of our book. Okay, so the next thing we're going to need to do is get the inside covered so we can figure out, actually that's not, there it is, figure out how to place our hinge. Okay, so looking up and down, so I'm trying to decide, do I want to cover it or... So there's two things you can do. You can lay your spine, you can lay your hinge down right now and then add 2 pieces to cover this chipboard, or we can cover the entire inside and then lay the hinge down on top of it. And I'm kind of going back and forth on that because I'm not happy with the fact that I don't have 12-inch sheet of paper. If I had a 12-inch sheet of paper, I'd cover the inside. But since I don't have 12 inches, I might do something different. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna have to take a break here. Okay, everyone, we are ready to insert our hinge into the album. And I'm just kind of giving this a visual once over. Again, my light's a little out of balance today. So I'm actually going to add some additional artificial light here. So bear with me for a second. See if I can't knock out some of those shadows. It didn't do a very good job. There we go. That's helping me a little bit. So I'm trying to see specifically the score lines here and the edge of this paper. These 2 tick marks indicate the 1/2 inch. So basically they should be writing very close to or on the score lines because that is a 1/2 inch from the first hinge. So it's very tight. So one of the things that I did in this album, that's not my preference, but I did it because I didn't have 12 by 12 paper, is I used an 8.5 by 11 to make this hinge. And because of the height of the paper, 9 inches, I couldn't score this way because I would only have 8.5 inch height and I needed 8 7/8. So I had to turn the paper this way and create my hinges. And as a result of that, I'm winding up with very little paper on either side, which I'm not terribly happy about because I think it's going to be a challenge to keep it down on the paper because it's running right into the score line. So the way to work around that, or the way I think I want to work around that, is I think I'm going to trim this off on both sides so that the hinge is completely nested inside of these 2 where the covers attach to the spine, because I don't think that's going to be enough to grip it on here. So again, I'm going to go ahead and trim these off real quick at a 1/2 inch from this mark. Now that's not my preference. My preference would have been to have more paper here, and if I had a 12 by 12, I could have accomplished that. I have trimmed off both sides so that these gussets will now fit in between these 2 score lines. I'm ready to move on to the next step, which is to apply adhesive to the entire back of this and then place it down here in our book. So I'm going to take a moment and do that. Okay, I've got all my tape on, so I'm going to remove my tape and I'm going to do glue on this so that I've got a few minutes to work with it before it's secured. It's not a requirement. It depends on how confident you are putting your hinge in. Some days I feel very comfortable and I can just lay it down. Other days, like today, I don't feel like my eyes are cooperating because of the shadows. So I want a few minutes to lay it down and then get my tool out and kind of check my measurements around the edges before I commit this by pressing down on it. So I'm going to get all the tape backing off. I'm going to remove a layer of glue across all the tape, just a thin squiggly lines. That's all you really need. And the reason for that is the glue, by putting the glue down on this surface, it's kind of a bead, and the bead is what's actually lifting this off this page. So you don't have to cover every square inch. That bead itself is helping you do the lifting. So you need to have some, but you don't need to cover every square inch. And then you just need to be careful about pressing down on the hinge until you're ready. So I know that's not totally obvious, and people have seen me do it. And I've also, when I was teaching this in person once, I saw somebody, I told them to put glue on it, and I saw that they were trying to cover every square inch. That's not necessary. It's really this bead, because of its height, what's holding the tape off the page. So the advantage is you get some time to move it around. The disadvantage is if you don't get it in straight, you can't remove it. The glue will tear the paper. If you put it in just with tape and you feel like you need to adjust it, you can still do that by using a product called Undo. And I'll show that to you right here. And if you run the Undo over the tape, it will release the adhesion and you can pull it off. And if you let the paper dry, you can actually use it again. But it is very time consuming if you do that process. So I prefer to actually just add a little glue and give myself the time to do the torquing until it's right where I want it. Okay. Now I'm just trying to flatten it out with my hands as much as possible. And also, if you don't have a lot of confidence, it's a good idea to go ahead and put a reference line, either on the top or the bottom, of where you think the end of this should land. So you don't have to work so hard to find your center while you've got glue drying on you. And I'm just going to give this a visual. I'm setting it down very lightly. And then I've got this tool that's got markings on it. And so I'm going to run it across the edge. And what I'm looking for is to make sure that the hinge is not drifting down or up. And by running this line across the bottom, I can see whether or not it's traveling up or traveling down because of the lines on here. And that's what I use this for. I don't always describe what I'm doing, but that is in fact what I'm doing. So by doing that, what I just discovered is it's drifting up. So I need to reposition it and pull this corner down. So let's give that a shot. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is right on. Okay, so it is a little to this side versus this side, but I think it's close enough. I'm really more concerned with it being up and down right, because you've got a 1/2 inch gusset really on either side to work with. So I'm going to start pressing it into place. And I'm going to start on one side, just move to the other, just in case it needs to inch over a little bit. Because if I'm going to have a bubble, I want to work it out. I don't want it to wind up in the middle of one of the hinges. So the hinge itself wants to curve because of all the scoring that we've done. That's why I want to work from one side to the other to work that slight curve out, which I've done. And now I'm pressing it firmly into place with my hand. And then I'm going to come back and do the same thing with my bone folder. And then we are done essentially constructing the album. So what needs to happen next is, let's get my corners down good, is we will install all of our pocket pages onto these hinges. So we'll want to put score tape on either side of the hinge, both sides, and then we'll remove the score tape, slip the pocket page on, and then adhere it. And I am actually going to try to do something different this video, and people have asked me about it before. I typically teach with the album completed, just because it gets very confusing where all the pages are. It just winds up being a sea of pages and flaps, and it's hard for me to describe whether I'm doing page 5 or page 2. So I install them in my book. But what I'm suggesting you do is hold them outside your book, because it'll be easier to decorate them flat. Once you install them, regardless of you know, how well you do constructing your album, you're always going to have this little bit of lift, and the more toward the center of the book, the greater the lift. So it's not going to be completely flat to work on. So I recommend you actually build your pages outside the book. When they're done, add them. But for the purpose of my future tutorial for this album, I'm going to go ahead and do the install because I think it's confusing for me to have all that paper laying around. And, you know, I can't stop and answer questions because this is not interactive. I'm just presenting to you, and you guys have to sort of consume what I'm delivering. If you have a question, you can't stop me. So I'm going to go ahead and install it because of those reasons, but I am recommending that you wait on installing and see if you can't design your pages and do your decorator installations outside the book. It'll save a lot of wear and tear on the cover, and it'll give you a completely flat surface to work with. Which I think there's some advantage to. So it will be critical though that you number your pages, and not just number them. You need to understand if this is page 1, which side is going to be toward the spine and which is going to be toward the outside. So if you number it, you need to make sure you number. This is 1, this is toward the spine, and this is 2. And that's toward the spine. So you'll need, if you number both sides, it'll make it pretty easy to see which way you install it. But if you only number one side, you'll need to know that this is the spine side and that's the outside or the pocket side. So I typically number it and put a S and a P, S for spine, P for pocket, so I know this is the side that goes toward the book. So that's just a trick I use to keep track of it when I'm building it outside of the book. You can add sticky notes. There's lots of different things you can do to make that easier. So for now, like I said, I'm going to stop here. This is where I'm asking you to stop. When I come back and start doing the tutorial, though, I will decorate these pages and they will be attached. So it's not required for you, but that's how I'm going to do it. So with that, I'm going to pause here and go ahead and finish my installation of the pages. And then the next time you guys join me, we'll actually be installing all of the features that are specific to the Joy to the World album. Those will be the interactive components for this album. So up until now, this is just a very simple, basic 7.5 by 9.5 mini album with 5 pages. So there's nothing custom about it. The customization will come in for the Joy to the World in the next video. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and I hope my instructions on how to figure out and calculate your measurements for your spine to add additional pages made sense to you. I will strip that out. It'll be in a tips section so that in the future, if you ever want to reference that and decide you want to add 6 pages, 7, whatever, or less, you won't have to watch this entire video. You can go to that 5-minute segment that says, here's how you calculate it, here's how you do it mathematically, and here's how you do it visually. So I tried to provide instructions for 2 methods to get to the same ends. So hopefully that's helpful for everybody. And thanks for tuning in. And again, the next time you join me, we will be working on the interactive pieces for Joy to the World. So for now, this is Daphne saying thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.